These Iron Rangers were recrafted by the folks at Unsung House, but it's been a while and now they're ready for a little refresh. My plan? Oxblood Roughout with an oiled look, paired with black dyed midsoles and a heel stack. The idea actually wasn't unique, and it came about while I was scrolling through Reddit, coming across a pair of Nick's mock toes in Oxblood Roughout. And I thought, first of all, those look incredible. And second, can I pull off something like that? I have some Hawthorne Red Wing boots, but the regular bottoming doesn't compare at all to these Nicks. But luckily and recently, I found these Iron Rangers upgraded by Unsung in Nashville, Tennessee. If you're not familiar, they don't just resole and recraft boots, they also relast them and build boots to measure. Now these boots sport a longer heel stack, resting on a Dr. Soul half sole setup, along with a leather midsole that Iron Rangers are desperately missing as stock from the Red Wing factory. As you can see, these boots were heavily waxed by their previous owner, so my first job is to strip off as much of that as possible. I've cleaned and conditioned plenty of boots before, including the last pair of Iron Rangers I filmed, but I never documented the rough out cleaning process on camera, so that's what I'll be showing you today. Fair warning, the cleaning methods you're about to see are pretty aggressive. I wouldn't call them routine maintenance at all. Think of this more as boot restoration entertainment. Conventional wisdom says a brass bristle brush is the best way to maintain rough out or suede. Normally, that's true, but these boots were waxed to the point they are so smooth on the surface, the bristles just glide right over it. To really clean them, I need to agitate that wax and raise the nap first. I'll be using scissors to scrape the surface, but honestly, anything with a blunt edge will work. Tweezers, a butter knife, whatever you got. Just don't use anything sharp that could stab the leather or your hand. Gloves are a good idea, by the way. You'll need to experiment with the direction of the strokes to lift the wax. It won't always line up with the natural lay of the nap, since the original dubbing could have been brushed on any which way. My goal is to go over the entire upper so none of the wax interferes with the dye later. Be patient here. The quality of the finish depends on how well the prep work is done. Even after scraping, some wax is going to remain. That's where the dish soap comes in. Straight, undiluted, and a lot of it. I'll work it across the whole upper and even in the insole, since there's some residue in there too. Again, this is not a maintenance tip. These are pretty extreme interventions. Only do this if you got extra boots lying around and don't mind experimenting. I'll let the soap sit for about 10 minutes before brushing it in with the brass bristle brush. While brushing, I'll rinse the boots under running water to flush out the wax, dirt, and soap. Because I'm using so much soap, it takes a few rounds of rinsing and wiping before the suds finally stop. Once they do, I'll use paper towels to blot out as much water as possible so the leather interior don't stay soaked. From there, the boots will sit overnight to air dry, and once they're ready, we can move on to the fun part. It's the next day, and the boots are fully dry, so we can continue with the prep. The leather is much furrier now, which is exactly what we want, but the nap isn't fully raised yet. So I'll bring the scissors back out to agitate the surface again. With the boots cleaned up, you'll start to see the original lighter shade of leather showing through, which is that light beige color. Prep is a lot of work, scraping and cleaning. It took me about an hour total, so if you ever try this yourself, don't be afraid to break it into phases. Once the nap is where I want it, I'll hit the boots with a brass bristle brush for a general cleanup, and then we can move on to taping off the midsole and outsole. Before that, let's go over what you'll need to make your own pair of Oxblood oiled Roughouts. Of course, you don't have to use Oxblood, you can choose any dye color you'd like. So here's my kit for this build. Angelus Oxblood leather dye for the uppers, 5-Bings black leather dye for the midsole, welt, and heel stack. I couldn't get the pro dye here in California. Gloves for basically every stage of the process, horsehair and brass bristle brushes, paper or towels to protect your workspace, 200, 400, and 600 grit sandpaper to strip the wax and finish from the midsole, a small paintbrush for the welt, wool daubers, one for the upper and one for the midsole, masking tape, Big 4 leather conditioner, which gives us that quote-unquote oiled part of the oil roughout name, a burnishing tool for the midsole and heel edges. I'll be improvising with a handle of a horsehair dauber brush for that, acetone and rubbing alcohol as a backup in case of mistakes or emergencies, and finally, make sure you're working in a well-ventilated space. In my earlier modding videos, I stressed how important it is to do a meticulous job taping off the sole. This time you'll see me be a bit more casual, because I'll be dyeing the welt, midsole, and heel stack black anyways, so if any Oxblood bleeds over, it'll get covered up. Still, I'll run tape along the boot's midsole and use a credit card style edge to really press it into the welt. If your boots have a wedge outsole, you'll probably want to be a lot more careful than I am here. Speaking of precautions, you'll notice my leather dye is sitting in a paper bowl, and the bottle itself is taped down on all sides. That's not overkill. It's experience. These bottles are light, small, and easy to knock over. I've done it before, and cleaning up spilled dye is not fun, and it's basically impossible. They tell you to put the bottle into the box that it came in, but that's still very small as far as surface area goes. Securing the bottle to something larger removes the risk, be it a bowl, a piece of cardboard, just do anything. With the taping done, let's move on to dyeing the roughout. I'm using a wool dauber, most kits include one, and of course gloves. Skip the gloves and your hands will be red for a week. When you pull the dauber from the bottle, let the excess drip off before touching the boot. The brush holds a lot of dye on its own, you don't need to overload it, and you don't want drops everywhere. As you probably noticed by now, I don't have much of a technique for this part, I'm just winging it. Roughout absorbs dye quickly, so you can move at a steady pace and don't stress about getting even coverage on the first coat. You can always come back with a second coat. Pay extra attention to the areas with multiple leather layers, like the true cap toes, heel panels, and eye stays and back stays. These spots usually need more dye on the next go around. Be careful with the unlined panels, the quarters and the tongue for instance. Don't oversaturate them and don't press the dauber too hard on those areas. If the dye seeps through, it can stain the inside of your boots and eventually your socks and feet when you wear it. Going back to the inspiration for this project, oiled roughout boots, like wax leathers, they use the flesh side of the hide. I've always wondered if the popularity has helped bootmakers make use of more hide, since smooth leathers require cleaner cuts and precise clicking, which can drive up error rates and cost. Either way, oiled roughout has a unique look, but it's not permanent. The mottled, oiled finish, it wears away after a few uses. Part of this experiment is figuring out how to restore that look myself. I remember one day I was conditioning a pair of boots, GH Bass Ranger moccasin boots, and the backstay was suede and the rest of the boot was smooth. I accidentally grazed my hand across the suede with Big 4, and I never forgot the result. I thought it was pretty cool. It looks similar to oil roughout boots from the likes of Truman and Pacific Northwest makers. Because of this, in this video, we'll use Big 4 to give that mottled, partially flesh, partially oiled look. After the first coat of dye, I'll let the boot sit for about 10 to 15 minutes, then I'll come back for a second coat. 2 is enough, and 1 bottle of Angelus dye covered both boots without issue. Alright, I'm back. The pair definitely needed more Oxblood, especially in these lighter patches. The cap toes and heel covers are obvious targets, while the quarters just needed slightly more. Again, don't over apply there though. For the tight spots near the welt, a small paintbrush or even a flattened Q-tip works great to push the dye into the crevices. The second coat took all but a couple of minutes. With the uppers finished, I'll let the boots dry overnight, then it's onto the midsole and welt with sandpaper, followed by black 5-Bings leather dye. It's been an overnight, and we're back to working on the midsole. Before we start, let's make sure the dye is mostly dry, and we'll test that by dabbing the boot with a paper towel. It looks fine, just some dye on the eyelets and speed hooks that we'll take care of at the end. We'll need to take off the tape now. To prepare the midsole for dyeing, we'll progressively sand it with 200, 400, and 600 grit sandpaper. Be careful not to sand the uppers, but you don't have to worry about the rubber outsole parts, they can be sanded without issue. Also, be sure to hit the bevel of the welt with your sandpaper as well. The finish comes off easily with the lowest grit, and it shouldn't take much elbow grease to achieve a smooth finish thereafter with the 400 and the 600 grit sandpaper. I find it much easier to work with small pieces of the paper. I only needed what amounted to maybe 8 square inches of sandpaper per coarseness. If you're a perfectionist, take it to the next level with 1000 grit sandpaper. With that out of the way, we have to burnish the leather to make sure the fibers are laying down all the way. Damp a paper towel with water and wipe down the midsole and heel. This gets rid of the dust, but also gives you some moisture to burnish with. I'm going to use the handle of one of my dauber brushes, but anything that has a smooth round end could work. It just needs to be harder than the leather. I'll move back and forth with a firm pressure, and after a few minutes an acceptable finish can be achieved. If you need that next level again, there are a bevy of ways to get glass-like finishes on a midsole edge with specifically made burnishing fluids and tools. I'm just showing something a little bit more approachable. Hopefully you have a steady hand for this next step, the dyeing of the welt and midsole. Using Black 5 leather dye and a fine-tip paintbrush, brush the dye onto the welt with care. Thankfully, Oxblood is very dark in color that a few over-dyeing spots from the black here and there wouldn't affect the look of the boot. But if you want some tips and advice, of course, don't overload the bristles with dye and work at an angle of maybe around 30 to 45 degrees to avoid the upper but still be able to access deep into the welt. Also, as the brush loses dye, don't force a tip too hard onto the leather, just load up a little bit more dye instead. If you feel the brush is loaded too much, just brush some of the dye onto the midsole and go back to the welt with less of a load. Now the welt is out of the way, the midsole and heel is easy. Grab your wool dauber and brush on the dye. One brushload of dye can easily cover half of a midsole edge. Once the dye has been applied, let your boots dry on a scrap piece of cardboard or a few paper towels so any excess doesn't leak onto the working surface or your floor. It's been a few hours, and now I'm checking to see if any dye is coming off with a quick wipe down with a paper towel, and nothing is coming off. I'll prepare to polish the midsole shortly, but let's brush down the uppers, as it's got slightly dusty with all of that sanding. Let's apply Big 4 to lay down the nap in some of the areas and give it that oiled finish. You don't have to be uniform with the conditioner, as oiled Roughout is not exactly consistent throughout. While we're waiting for the Big 4 to set, I'll apply some of the Venetian leather balm to act as a polish for the midsole edge, but traditionally you'll want to either use Resolene from Vibings, which is an acrylic sealant, or you can go more natural with wax and use beeswax or sapphire wax to get a polished edge. Now we're waiting for both the Big 4 and balm to set, so I'll use it as an opportunity to clean the eyelets with a paper towel. The dye wipes away really easily. I have two brushes ready, one for the midsole and one for the upper. Starting with the polishing of the midsole edge, the Venetian takes a shine really quick as usual, hence why I love the product so much. It's just easy to use, and once again, it's an approachable way to get this done. One of the hallmarks of oiled Roughout is how the nap peeks through the matted areas kind of randomly and sporadically, and we can achieve this by brushing the areas we conditioned with Big 4. You can see some of that happening already. Whenever the Big 4 wears off and the nap is popping up all over your boot, you can just apply another indiscriminate layer of Big 4 and it's back to that unique oiled look. With a set of black leather laces, the transformation is complete. These Oxblood Roughout Iron Rangers are now in the rotation, standing out from the sea of my black, brown, and tan boots I already own. So thanks so much for sticking around to the end. If you enjoyed the process, please give the video a like and consider subscribing for more boot mods and experiments.